Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, wherever you are around the world. We tend to have a global audience at these events. My name is Joy Connolly. I'm honored to serve as president of the American Council of Learned Societies, or as we call it in-house and around the world, ACLS. So welcome to this latest panel, this latest public discussion in an ACLS series that we began in 2020 of public discussions that we call Humanistic Scholarship in the 21st Century. And today, our topic is Focus on China, and we're honored to have as guests two leading thinkers who will discuss the condition of public understanding of China in the United States, or lack thereof, gaps that need to be filled. We'll talk about how scholars and academia can best disseminate their knowledge in the public sphere. We'll talk about challenges to reporting or doing research in China and a range of other topics. But before that, we start that discussion, I want to begin by saying a few words about ACLS. We have learned over the years of doing these panels that one of the great virtues of them is not only having our guests talk and share their knowledge and insights with us, but because it's a chance for us to expand our audiences, reach more people, get to know more people, expand our networks. We're very grateful for that. It's made me also realize, though, that we should spend just a couple minutes at the beginning of these events describing who we are and what it is, what we do. And I promise I'll be very brief. After I do this, I'll then introduce my colleague, Dina Raghavan, who is our Senior Program Officer in International Programs, and she's going to describe in a little bit of detail, but also staying brief because we know you're here to hear our speakers. She'll talk about ACLS's decades-long engagement in China studies specifically. So ACLS, I like to say that we have four constituencies, and if you'll forgive the alliteration, it's easier to remember this way. We serve scholars, schools, learned societies, and the system of higher education itself. How do we do this? Well, we support scholars, and we're probably best known, I think, certainly in academia for this work through over a dozen programs offering fellowships and grant supports to scholars inside and outside the United States. We also support scholars through networking initiatives and mentorship programs and related services. When it comes to schools, we convene representatives of our two membership organizations, the Research University Consortium and the ACLS Associates Network. And we do this with the goal of enabling the sharing of information and strategies, frankly, to strengthen the humanities and social sciences in an age where public skepticism and devaluation of these fields is strong. So we seek to be equally strong or stronger in countering that. Societies, our 79 learned societies, form another network of mutual support. And I'm afraid if I start talking about them, I'll go on for too long. So I'll simply direct you to our website to learn more about our membership list, our constitutive membership list. And finally, the system. We seek to make the system of higher education more humane, more responsive to current needs, more inclusive, by fostering equity and justice initiatives like our Intention Foundry and leadership initiatives like one of our newest programs, which convenes over 60 deans of various stripes to come together to talk about making the academy a better place. This is called the Leadership Institute for a New Academy. With the support of foundation partners and philanthropic partners, we also feature, and this is the main focus for today, international programs. And our international programs have in recent years focused on particular regions of the world, on China, obviously, on Buddhist studies, on the humanities in 5 countries in Africa, and our newest program, a summer seminar in Eastern Europe for scholars, I should say, of Eastern and South Central Europe, to be held in Bulgaria starting this June. It's a new 3-year program. And we're very proud of our decades-long record of engagement with particular regions around the world and to consider how best to sustain that for the future, especially in a time, as you'll hear, when challenges to study around the world are growing more intense. We've set up a series of global engagement strategy sessions that bring together graduate students and recent PhDs and senior scholars and board members to talk about the most urgent needs in sustaining international study and how ACLS can best step in to help. So that's a perfect place for me to pause and turn it over for a few minutes to Dina Raghavan, as I said, our Senior Program Officer in International Programs, and she's going to talk about our longstanding commitment to China studies, thanks to the generosity of the Henry Luce Foundation. I'll just say, I could say a lot, but I will keep it brief. Dina holds her PhD in Ancient Near Eastern Studies from Harvard and came to ACLS a little over a year ago from the Clinton Foundation. So Dina, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Joy. As Joy said, I'm the Senior Program Officer for International Programs here at ACLS. And one of our key programs is the Luce ACLS program in China Studies, supported by the Henry Luce Foundation. So ACLS has a really long history of supporting and promoting scholarly collaboration between the US and China, from making grants for the study of Far Eastern civilizations as early as 1929, to establishing in 1963 the University's Service Center, which is now, I believe it's still part of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And the Luce ACLS program in China Studies is really just the latest iteration of this work, the latest in a 40-year partnership between ACLS and the Luce Foundation, offering fellowships at the moment to early career scholars for research on China in any discipline of the humanities and interpretive social sciences. The program aims to extend the understanding of Chinese culture and history through research, education, and international collaboration. In the last few years, starting in 2020, with the support and encouragement of the Foundation, ACLS has been embarking on a new project to examine the field and reimagine the program in order to meet current issues in the field, from the geopolitical tensions between the US and China to challenges more broadly in higher education, such as declining enrollments in the humanities. So over the past few years, ACLS, in partnership with our excellent steering committee and faculty advisors, has engaged in a real series of strategic planning activities. We organized a survey of the field, hosted a series of convenings, brainstorming sessions, and focus groups on key topics. We've brought together dozens of scholars, experts, journalists, artists, curators, and more. And we've asked all of these folks a variety of questions, from how to best define China studies, what impact scholarship can have beyond the academy, how we can foster a more equitable, inclusive, and diverse field, and what the biggest obstacles are to research on China. And across these discussions, a lot of common themes have emerged, and a lot has changed in recent months from China opening up. So a lot of these discussions have proved that, we can't always be ready for everything. But a lot of common concerns and themes came up, from the desire to see more training and more recognition of public-facing work, as well as the need for greater scholarly community, particularly for early career scholars, as well as those who may be the only China studies person at their institution. And many of these findings echo findings by our society memberships, such as Modern Languages Association, who found similar issues across language and literature fields. But other concerns that came up are more specific to China studies, including the real serious concern about the growing securitization of research on China, as well as the need for us all to think more broadly around what Chinese-ness and what China studies really means. We continue to talk with the Luce Foundation, with our partners, with our scholars, about the results of these conversations. But in the meantime, we remain deeply committed to the program and to advancing public understanding of China. And on that note, I'm happy to turn things back to Joy to properly introduce our two guests.
Thanks, Dina. Perfect introduction. So with that framing, I'm so looking forward to the conversation with our two guests, and let me introduce them. And I will only say that it's our habit in these sessions to introduce our speakers really in very brief terms, which don't at all match their eminence and impact in the world at large. So I've already cleared this with both of them, and so they're not expecting a long rehearsal, which I could easily do because their records are long and eminent. As I said, they're people who really command a public audience, and rightly so, because of the quality of their insights into the topics on which they write. Let me start with Peter Hessler. Peter, I'm just going alphabetical order. Peter, thank you for joining us. Peter joined the Peace Corps in 1996 and was sent to China for a couple of years to teach English in a small city near the Yangtze River. He has written and is, I think, best known for his, or very well known for his 4 books on China. Oracle Bones: A Journey Through Time in China, published in 2006, was the first book of Peter's I came across. He's also published a book on archaeology in Egypt, and as he's moved from China back to the U.S., spent some time in Cairo, back to the U.S. again. And I will say that that in Peter's work, writing for the New Yorker, where he's a staff writer, he writes with a real lucidity and again, the feeling of really opening a window into everyday life in China, as well as in the big issues, geopolitical issues, defining the whole planet. So, Peter, again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Really terrific to have you.
Thanks. Very happy to be here.
Thank you. Kaiser Kuo also joins us today. He's a freelance writer, a podcaster, and a musician. He has a varied career moving inside, I would say, the world of technology correspondence in journalism, but also working in tech itself. He used to write a column for an English language magazine, The Beijinger, for 10 years. But in 2010, and this is, I'm going to venture to guess where Kaiser has had enormous impact, he started the Sinica podcast, a current affairs podcast that was based in Beijing, that featured prominent China journalists, but also people inside China to speak frankly and candidly about politics, about the economy, about society. His list of guests on that show, on that podcast, is long and really incredibly impressive. He releases the podcast every Friday. I think that's still correct, Kaiser?
Thursday.
No, Thursday. Sorry. Thank you. I wanted to give a shout out to that. He's also editor at large at the digital media company SupChina and
the China Project. We changed our name a while.
Oh, you did? Oh, I'm sorry about that. I should have checked. The China Project, it offers, and I can tell the Google Translate is working because I got flipped when we were looking into your work months ago, straight to an unbelievable, extraordinary collection of resources. So both these guests who know each other, I should say, and have a great vibe interacting with one another. I'm really pleased to have you in conversation. So thank you for joining us at ACLS.
Thanks so much, Joy. Great to see you, Pete.
Nice to see you, Kaiser.
So I'm going to start with a couple of questions that we've had a little bit of discussion beforehand about, and about 5 o'clock, we'll turn it over to 5 o'clock Eastern, I should say. We'll turn it over to questions and engagement from our audience, which is going to be funneled my way, and I'll share those questions. So I say that please to keep in mind, all of you in the audience online. I confess I wish we were all here in a big room together, but we're not. We can still communicate, though, thanks to the miracle of technology. So please feel free to post your questions at any time, and just know that about 5 o'clock, that's when we'll turn to that part of the discussion. So let me kick things off, though, and the goal here really is to have an informal conversation. It's not an interrogation or a Q&A, but let me get us started by asking both of you this, and I'll let you jump in as you like. Both of you know better than anyone, certainly better than most, the landscape of American public understanding of and misperceptions too about China. And so could you comment for us, and keeping in mind, you're here, as you know, because you're public intellectuals, you're engaged with and connected with public audiences that scholars of China, we could generalize and say humanistic scholars generally, both hunger to reach public audiences, also often don't quite know how to do it, don't know how to best funnel their energy to do that, and they don't always know, and they seek guidance on, or they seek debate and argument about what areas and issues need the most engagement by scholars in particular. So, as I said, knowing the landscape of public understanding as you do, could you comment on the areas of the issues where you see the most need for engagement by scholars in particular?
Pete, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just as as somebody who's moved back and forth a couple of times, I mean, I think that in the United States that, politics really dominates our discussion of China, and that's really, where it begins and ends for a lot of people. It doesn't necessarily dominate life in China, at the individual level. And I think, that's an important thing for people to sort of understand and to somehow to get more of a sense of how daily life works there, and also the kind of things that people care about, because often these sort of big political ideas are not really what's driving people on the ground in China. So I think that's always a challenge when you're talking to American citizens, is to somehow convey the normalcy of life in China, and the fact that not everybody is living under a weight. There certainly are, significant numbers of people who are, but there's also large sectors of society that, they're living sort of average, everyday, normal lives, and we need to know their values, their interests, what are their concerns, the things that they worry about.
Amen. I mean, and I think nobody does it better than you, Pete. I would completely agree. I would also say that, within politics itself, I mean, I don't think there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to understand China through at least one lens of politics, but it's the securitization, this problem that Dina brought up in her introduction, that I think is a really big one, is that there's this habit now to reach for that one sole lens and to only view, even within the narrow realm of politics, everything through a strictly national security lens. So that's a really, really bad problem. I think that if to Pete's point about the need to understand Chinese people better and their lives outside of the strictly political. A few years ago, many years ago now, a friend of mine suggested that the question that dominates American thinking on China, what Americans in their heart of hearts really want to know, is, why don't you hate your government as much as I think you should? Mm-hmm. And a lot of it just sort of flows from there. I mean, that sort of says it all. And so I think part of what I'd like to see, well, first of all, there isn't an area of scholarship on China that isn't incredibly vital and shouldn't be, better funded, with more people doing, more work and having better access to. That's what we want. We want that 360-degree holistic view on China. We want to touch all pieces of the elephant and not just the trunk, or in this case, the tusks, the sort of warlike tusks of the elephant. So what I would like to see is I think that this whole conversation around, why aren't they talking, out of the ivory tower and getting in touch with people better, that's sort of secondary. I think the first thing is that they need to just stop seeing it through that one single lens. That, I mean, it's just simply better if they see it through one. I guess my one beef that I have is this. So many of our best and brightest, when they work on intellectuals in China, which are really, really important, I mean, intellectual life in China, they end up focusing on critical or dissident intellectuals only, which is understandable. They're sexier. I mean, it's a lot more fun, certainly, to engage with those people. But we stop understanding what a friend of mine asked. I think that's the right question. Like, who's the David Brooks of China, and what does he think? Right? Just sort of an average public intellectual who's more mainstream. Now, there are people doing amazing work in specifically this field, and just like more establishment public intellectuals like Timothy Cheek, I would give him a huge shout out. And also this fantastic translation project that's happening right now at CSIS, where they're translating a lot of papers from Chinese and causing quite a splash as people are realizing, the depth of some of this scholarship. But that's sort of one of the big problems. If all we're reading is Murong Xuecun and Yu Hua and Ai Weiwei, then we're not really getting ordinary Chinese folks or more mainstream establishment intellectuals.
Yeah, and I think also getting back to the securitization and this, I mean, it's important to, when we're trying to think about China, it's important also to think about things about our own culture that could, shape the ways that we look at China. And I always, having moved back and forth a few times, I'm always struck by how militaristic American society is, right? And this is going to influence the way we look at China. And you just, like, I mean, just the other day when I was at my kid's basketball game in rural Colorado, when we were at another school and they come out and do the national anthem, and you've got a kid with the POW flag and a kid with the American flag and two junior high kids holding rifles. It's like at an American public school. I mean, I've never seen that in China, right? And the sort of the level of militarization in our society is something that we need to remember, and that this, we can transfer that to other places. And I think in some ways in China, I've always been struck by that, by how basically non-militaristic everyday society is. And the average Chinese, like I have all of these students that I taught in the 1990s that I'm in touch with, almost 100 of them. And I don't know any of them that wanted their kid to go into the military in any form, right? I mean, it doesn't move through society the same way that it does in the United States. It doesn't mean that it's not important, but it's a different, it plays a different role. And so sometimes we need to remember not to, see everything through our own values, and to let our own tendencies shape the way we're looking at others.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's I'm thinking 10 things at once, but one question that is very much in our minds at ACLS and around the humanities and social sciences these days, in the wake of a couple of essays, including one in the New Yorker called "The Death of the English Major," was about the decline of interest generally, in interest as measured by enrollments and majors, I should say. I don't want to make any generalized statements because that's what I want to ask about, actually. In the message of these this essay by Nathan Heller in the New Yorker called "The Death of the English Major," and a couple of other related pieces that have come out recently, is that through for a variety of reasons, but I think it's fair to say largely because of the cost of college and the increasing pressure on students to graduate with an employable, with a major that they think will be legible, outside in the world of work, that it's pulling them away from classes and majors of study that are considered more luxury items, like anything really in the humanities and the humanistic social sciences. So with that as background, I'm wondering, as you think about in this question of where we see more engagement by scholars, where we need to kind of redress the gap in public understanding in the United States of China and things related to China, thinking about that more focused in the college context. Do you think there are either particular obstacles getting in the way of, from where you sit, kind of out, you're not tenured faculty trying to teach classes, so and attract students in them, but are there particular obstacles in the way of studying China in particular, or do you see it as a broader, as part of the broader picture of students moving away from the humanities, at least again in terms of majors, or do you have ideas about how to pull those students back in?
Well, zooming out first and to talk about it sort of in the broader cultural context, I think that you've put your finger on a lot of the problems there. I mean, that there's this real pressure because, as you say, of the cost of college. I've got a daughter, I'm paying out of state tuition right now for one, and fretting about my next one who's starting college next year. But that's crippling, of course, and there is a lot of pressure for them to pursue a STEM field or something that's going to immediately pay off. But I think that layered on top of that is this sense of competition with China right now. I think the one thing that a lot of Americans do know about China, rightly or wrongly, is they think of them as this 10-foot tall tech juggernaut that is eating our lunch, in artificial intelligence and quantum computing. And the only way we're going to beat them is if we, graduate more engineers. And now I am somebody who, I chant this mantra every day: let's not try to out China. I mean, I think that if we have a strength as a country in competition with China, it might just be that we aren't so fixated with the natural sciences and with engineering, that we do have a lot of our intellectual life, our rich intellectual life, and our cultural life is still coming out of people with backgrounds in the humanities and in the humanistic social sciences. And I am a huge proponent of that. So I think that part of the problem here, why we're suffering this pathology, is that we're locked into this mindset of competition with China.
Yeah. I mean, I was an English major in college, and then I did a graduate degree in English. And actually, I never took a course on China or Chinese, and until I joined the Peace Corps in 1996. Really knew nothing about China, but I knew a lot about Dickens, and I knew a lot about Joseph Conrad and William Shakespeare, and those were actually very useful things to bring to China. Having that background, I think, gave me a different sensibility as a writer, as an observer. I think maybe I saw China and the people around me more in the way that Dickens would have seen them, in the sense of watching these individuals make their way through this incredible moment of change, and with this resourcefulness, and sometimes, sometimes using their wiles or doing things that were illegal or semi-legal. I mean, that kind of perspective, I think, is invaluable. And I think one thing actually that I have appreciated, and then of course I started writing about China pretty early, after I'd only been there for 2 years. I did find the community of China scholars to be quite open to me. And actually later, when I went to Egypt, I found Middle Eastern studies much more closed in the United States. And I found that people didn't like an outsider coming to that field. And if you weren't part of the proper path, they really didn't want anything to do with you. So I think that has been, in my experience at least, a strength in China studies, that it has welcomed people from different perspectives. And it is really important. I mean, that was, of course, I came in the Peace Corps, and one of the great things about the Peace Corps is that it took a whole bunch of people like me and threw us there. And we didn't have preconceptions about China. We didn't have ideas about what we were going to see. We just sort of figured it out. And a lot of those people ended up, doing good work in China, like somebody like Rob Schmitz, who's a correspondent for NPR, and has done great work. So I want the field to stay open in that sense, and to remember that these other, perspectives are really, really useful.
I would also add that part of the problem that we have when we look at China right now is that we don't have a grounding in history. And what I mean, I'm often enjoining people to look to China, quote unquote, experts, to the analysts and to the China watchers, and look for evidence of that kind of historical acuity. And when I say that, I don't mean that they have to, know the order of the emperors of the Ming and Qing dynasties sequentially, and their reign dates and the reign years and all that stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about more historiography and then their own idea of history. I think that it's really important. The problem, one of the big problems that we face right now in not only our dealings with China, but in our dealings with Russia, with Iran, and with a lot of other countries around the world that are sort of non-Western, or at least only quasi-Western, is that so many of us just sort of have swallowed this kind of Whiggish teleological view of history, this idea that history is marching inexorably toward a goal, and that goal, of course, is liberal Western democracy, capitalist democracy, and we don't really kind of interrogate that assumption. And it's so baked into our language, that when we talk about, the moral arc of history being long but bending toward justice, it might be a very nice sentiment, but it doesn't actually accurately describe history, nor does, this idea that you're behind the curve of history, right? What I think a more sophisticated understanding of history understands its inherent contingency, and that, the big grand amnesia event that we had after the collapse of Soviet communism from 89 through 91, we just sort of forgot that history is still very much happening and alive, and that it has enormous gravitational pull on these other countries. I think that it's only by a kind of humanistic approach that you come to an understanding of that kind of historical gravity of the limits to the possibilities of change in another society, and the folly of just standing here on one side of an historical chasm and waving over across and saying, come on over, just come be like us. And I mean, this is what we've done, and I think that this has led to some really terrible policy on our part when it comes to all these other actors.
So Kaiser, I'm hearing you saying that, and I mean, of course, I wholeheartedly agree that there's an urgent need for deeper historical understanding so that we can grasp current events and grasp the past and understand the past for its own sake. And Peter, you said you've noticed welcoming by China studies scholars in your career as you've moved through it. So with those kind of positives in mind, how can you talk about how scholars working within the academy can translate their research for a general audience, and maybe especially people studying the deep past, pre-modern fields, and what do you think what are the pitfalls people fall into, or maybe even better, what are the best ways for them to be heard?
Yeah, I mean, I think learning to write better is always good. And I think it's something that oddly we don't spend a lot of time on, actually, in academics and in, especially when you get to advanced study. I mean, people in graduate school will have to take languages and they'll have to do all kinds of things to prepare. They should really have, good nonfiction writing classes, and because there's a lot of very technical things that you can learn. It's not, there is a sense often that writing is genetic, or it's just a gift, something you're born with, and it's totally crazy. I mean, when I was at Princeton, I was rejected for 3 straight semesters for the first level creative writing class in fiction. I wasn't until my 4th. I came out of a public school in Missouri. I didn't have a great background, and I had to be better before I could even get in the class. But I learned a lot there. I had some teachers like John McPhee who taught us really good technical things, like what's a set piece, how do you use this, what's a page break. These are things that I would later teach, my friends in Beijing when we were, working on long stories. That should be part of graduate school, as far as I'm concerned. And you see a lot of the people you talk about in history, like Jonathan Spence. I think he started as an English major. Was he an English major at Cambridge, or he had some background where he wanted to be a fiction writer? I'm not sure. David Keatley, for example, wanted to be a fiction writer who wrote so well about the Shang Dynasty. These were people who thought very seriously about how do you write, how do you convey something. We can do a much better job of that.
Oh, I've never heard that idea articulated before, but my God, you're right. Yeah, that's you're absolutely correct. It's the horrible prose that one encounters in academia. Sometimes it is a gigantic barrier. But I think another one is that they need outlets for it. I mean, there need to be more people who are proactively, trying to help them popularize it, to who have platforms. I mean, I think that's basically my whole raison d'etre. I mean, that's what I exist to do. To try to do this. I would also shout out programs like the Public Intellectuals program at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, that selects people, and that it gives them that kind of media training, and it just sort of encourages them to cross-pollinate, to just they're busted out of their little library carols in the dark, dusty corners of the stacks, and they're made to interact with people in quite disparate fields of China studies, because that kind of pollination, I mean, that cross-pollination is incredibly valuable to it. But again, I wanted to say, I think that one of my big bugbears that I don't like to hear is this insistence that whatever you're working on, that you try to make it somehow relevant to current affairs. I don't think that that's something we ought to be doing. I think that scholarship in the distant past, in far-flung geographies, is just inherently valuable, and that we shouldn't not everyone is cut out to do that. But if you are an historian of 20th century China, I think there's some obligation to involve yourself in the broader discourse. You have valuable things to say. If you're studying the Bronze Age, maybe not so much. And there are people who study, say, Bronze Age philosophy, who sometimes maybe get a little too insistent about the relevance of their stuff to understanding modern China in a way that I feel is kind of embarrassing. But not naming names at all.
Well, I would say, just from the ACLS perspective, one of the one of the structural issues we wrestle with is advocating, or we're seeking to advocate, I should say, more clearly in light of what you just said. We're seeking to advocate for the expansion of what counts. What faculty in appointed in universities and colleges get rewarded for writing, and academia is very good at rewarding highly specialized scholarship, and that's a great good. And as you were both saying in different ways, that must continue, and it will, as long as we're here to fight for it, and many others too. But to reward public-facing writing, writing that's really good, strong, powerful, whether it's about Bronze Age China or the 20th century or now, that can be harder to get the recognition in the academy that it deserves, and that's one of the things. That's a change, as I said, we're advocating for. Well, we've now talked for a few minutes about writing about and scholarship about China, about challenges, pitfalls, potential ways forward, and capacities. The capacity for clarity, above all, that scholars should cultivate. But can we turn to China now specifically, and hear your thoughts about deep challenges, call them structural challenges, to reporting on or studying, doing research in China, that you see maybe growing more acute in coming years? What's ahead?
Pete, you want to jump in? Sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess, the biggest one is just access at this point. I mean, it's, we've lost, 2 years basically, or more really. And yeah, 3, people not being able to go into China, not being able to do research. I mean, it was really sad. I mean, I was there from 2019 to the summer of 2021. So I was there through a good chunk of the pandemic. And when I arrived in 2019, I met I was in Chengdu, and I met a number of young scholars from Britain, from America, from other places, who were doing interesting work in Chengdu and good research. And they all ended up out, January, February, and they didn't come back, and some of them ended up having to change their career track, basically, because they can't wait forever at that age, and when I was 29 years old and had just finished a draft of Rivertown, I went back to Beijing and I set up as a freelancer, and that period was really critical for me. And if I had been cut off at that point, things would have been totally different, and how patient would I have been? Would I have wanted to wait 3 years to go back to this place, or would I have found something else to do? So I think that that's a real crisis, in that we're at risk of losing a generation of China specialists, or having China specialists who have not had as much access as they needed to have. That concerns me.
So besides just the access to sources and to archives and to that material, it's just sort of access to the atmospherics of being in China. I mean, just to that osmotic absorption of the vibe or whatever. That's so incredibly valuable. I mean, I don't, just soaking in the place, walking around, hearing people talking, just conversations, just snippets of conversation. You just get such a better sense of it. I think that one of the problems already that bedevils American understanding of China is that so many folks, for so many, it's just it's part of this American imaginary. It's not real. People aren't real. The problems aren't real. We use it as this sort of distant construct, to fight our own domestic political fights, and we don't treat it as a real place. That is in danger of becoming much worse, because not now. I mean, they used to be that, hundreds of thousands of Americans annually would visit China, at least, and there were tens of thousands who were there, or just studying and soaking it in. I think that now we face the danger of it becoming as distant and remote, as unreal as Iran, and that is genuinely dangerous, because when you can actually dehumanize people in that way, when you don't encounter them in your everyday life, then the unthinkable becomes, unfortunately, way more thinkable, and that's what profoundly scares me right now. So, look, part of your question was about the difficulties of, look, let's not sugarcoat this. Even, in the best of times, being a reporter there was really tough, right? I mean, there's surveillance, there's harassment, there's sometimes, detention, and people get knocked around sometimes. And it's hard. I mean, just they wear you down with just bureaucratic obstacles and things like that. I mean, but you look at a guy like Pete. I mean, he finds a way just to do it. I mean, he, part of it is because he has just such a maybe a common touch, just sort of an ability to connect with ordinary people in a way. He doesn't have to, write in for permissions to interview high level people. He just kind of walks around and does stuff, and that's actually more valuable to me these days. Is that kind of reporting.
And that we actually have a comment from an audience member I'm going to weave in because it's relevant here, and it picks up on something we were talking about a few minutes ago about public intellectuals in China and where our focus or where our range should fall, where our concentration should fall, I guess, as scholars and journalists. Do we focus on dissidents? And Kaiser, I think you were saying that that if we do just that, we're in danger of a certain kind of echo chamber or fantasy that we're building on our own. But if we look as and this is the question from the audience member, if we look at not dissidents, but officials, people authorized, intellectuals authorized or endorsed by the government, are we then not in danger of simply having the regime's values and priorities reinforced?
I hope this person wasn't seriously thinking that I meant only listen to those people. Of course,
I don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's absurd. I mean, I was just arguing for that 360-degree view, and please have a little faith. I want, to include all those voices. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think your starting point is important, right? And what are you looking for? How are you looking for it? And I always felt like as a journalist that a lot of journalism was driven mostly by issues, and so you chose an issue and then you looked for people within that issue. And maybe again it was because my background was more in literature. I tended to either start with character or place. There was somebody who interested in me or a place that interested me, which is the way most novels start. And then I would investigate that, and the issues came in, but the issues came in naturally. And then I think sometimes that was a good starting point because then the issues were subservient to the person. Whereas, if you take the other approach, then sometimes the issue, the one child policy, whatever, is that dominates everything, and the people are just, kind of stand-ins for this larger point you're making. So thinking sometimes about that kind of methodology of how you begin, what grabs your interest, sometimes that's a big part of it.
That and when I think about whether the issues that you're both talking about, I think my mind goes straight to more long form journalism, whether that's written or podcast. How has the emerging, all the variety of social media available to people today affected you, and how are you seeing social media as well affecting the circulation of knowledge in China? Is it and generationally, I imagine it's different. And does the impact of social media play out the same way in China and North America, do you find?
Pete, do you want to jump in?
No,
you're not on
a lot
Twitter.
Of questions all at once.
Because you know more about this. I mean, I'll let you start, Kaiser.
All right. Well, there's a lot in that question, but let me start with this piece about how it's affecting the way that we report and things like that. There are a couple of things that I find are kind of pernicious habits that I wish people would back off from among American reporters. This habit of kind of going into the social media feeds and then just cherry picking a few choice quotes to back up whatever point it is that you're trying to make. And often it's going to be extremely strident stuff. And I mean, that's because this is something I've said for over a decade now, but it really is the case that social media conditions you toward that kind of stridency and extremism, because you find very quickly, look, we all post something on Twitter and then we go back a few minutes later to see how many likes or retweets it's gotten or whatever, and we get a little dopamine squirt from that, and we're like the rats with cocaine, and we just keep doing whatever action it is that seems to yield the best reward, and that action happens to be emotionally activating language, really, really strident and extreme language that evokes indignation or rage or hatred or what have you. And it's never the kind of even-handed milk toast kind of plain, boring answers, right? Or the boring statements. This isn't the early days of Twitter when you could just get by tweeting what you had for lunch. So that's a problem. I mean, that dynamic is the same in China. Of course, it's tempered by the really, really rigid censorship there, but it's not entirely tempered by it. And there are plenty of people who are tweeting in Chinese outside of the confines of the Great Firewall, and those get cherry picked over as well. So I would urge everyone caution there. But another bad effect of it, I think, is that this is not just the China watching world. This is everybody. We are now in this kind of common present that we've all been jammed into, where things that happen in far-flung corners of the world are immediately brought to our attention. And often they're brought to our attention and we are expected to render a kind of moral verdict on them. We have our dockets, our daily moral dockets are very, very full. We have to pass judgment on a million different crisis issues. How do you stand on this? Do you stand with it? And we don't know. Most of the time we have very, very little context to go by. I mean, and of course, the activists who are pushing a particular issue, it's in their interest to squeeze out the nuance and just to polarize everything into a clear black and white. And so we end up making these kind of Manichaean proclamations day in and day out about issues. And this is the stuff that drives Twitter. It's this, just constant rendering of judgments. It's that purity of indignation that President Obama talked about. It's very satisfying, I suppose, and addictive. And this isn't making for good policy. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not the best person on this question because I don't like social media. I avoid it. Part of it is just because I feel like it seems like it would be, I mean, I've never been on Facebook, or I've never had a Twitter account. And I feel like it would be damaging to my attention span, and I just don't want to deal with it. The other reason is just that they don't pay you. If I write on, I'm a capitalist. I'm like, I'm straight from Adam Smith. Like, I write because I get paid. That's how I make a living. I don't have anybody else giving me money. And I don't write for free, and I don't do that for Twitter. I'm not gonna donate my words to Elon Musk, right? And so I don't care.
The right stuff, and the Chinese Communist Party will give you 50 cents a post, right?
Yeah, but I've just avoided it. Which maybe is, it probably limits me in some ways because I don't write about it in the same way. But, I did find in China, like you have to be on WeChat in China. And that's the only social media I was engaged with. And I actually find that as a writer, like as Kaiser said, when I am quoting people, I'm not going to pick stuff off Weibo. I mean, I can find people to talk to and sort of get their real, make sure that I know who they are and what they're saying. But it was useful to be on WeChat in China in the sense that you do learn a lot about how people are functioning, especially like when your kids are in a Chinese public school. I'm writing about this now, and like being on the parent list for WeChat is terrifying, right? I mean, the first day there was like 46 messages. The second day there were 70 messages. The third day there were 237, which is one message every 6 minutes for 24 hours, and it's insane, right? But that does it helps when I'm writing about it. I'm referring to these things because it tells me something about the engagement with education and the parents' fears and the things that they're the way they approach child rearing. So it is useful in that sense, I find. So I don't totally dismiss it, but generally speaking, as a writer, I feel like I have to protect some part of my mind and my attention.
Dina, can we go back just a bit to that question you asked about reporting on China? Because there's stuff that I've heard Pete talk about before that I really would love for him to expand on here. I don't remember the exact context. I think it was you were in conversation with Ian or something like that. But you were talking about structural issues in the way foreign correspondence is done, and whether it's possible or even the right approach to export our kind of domestic adversarial speak truth to power model to China and expect to be able to get understanding on based on that.
Yeah, I mean, that was partly from teaching. So, I taught in 1996, 1998 in Fuling, which was a small place. In those days, was very remote and was quite poor. And I was teaching students who were mostly from the countryside, and they were English majors, and they were going to become teachers. And we had these textbooks, like we had a textbook about America, and they had this section on social problems. And it was just this crazy litany of stuff like, in this year, 25 people were raped on the University of South Carolina campus, and this person was shot over here, and all these random. And I remember kids saying, "Well, is it true the Washington Bullets had to change their name from the Bullets because of gun violence in America?" It was just like these kind of random facts that these.
No, but the Redskins did have to.
But these kids were learning. And actually each individual fact was true, right? I mean, I'm sure that there were people who were raped on this campus or whatever, that were shot in this place. But was this the first thing they should know about the United States, right? That was my question. As a teacher, it was very frustrating, that this was the way that this country was being introduced to them. It was basically stuff was being taken out of American daily news headlines and then exported to China. And of course, in America, in the newspaper, if you read this stuff, you have the context and you have the background and okay, well, our newspaper reporter is covering this because it's a problem and we need to know about it because we already know what daily life is like. But the problem is when you export that, right? Because the Chinese kids didn't know the daily life. They had no perspective. So once I sort of switched over and became a writer and was writing about China for Americans, I remembered that experience. I remembered how frustrating it was to see my own culture sort of portrayed in its extremes. And I was, not going to do that, from the other side. I wasn't going to take the most extreme things in China. Also, I didn't see the point, like in America, you might look for some very specific local problem and you write about it because then the problem gets solved. But if you do that same thing in China, maybe they just arrest the people involved who gave you the information. They don't solve the problem. And then the people in America are just confused sometimes, so it's also just like, what is your role? Your role is not always to be a whistleblower. I mean, that's useful to do. And there are great projects in China that involve that, but you also do need to give people some context. You do need to convey the everyday. And so that was something that I, always thought about. And I think that the experience of having been on the other side was really formative in that sense. And, and also one thing that I think that journalists should really learn from the social sciences is the idea of methodology, and the emphasis on methodology, which is that, one thing I value. My father's a social scientist. He's a sociologist. And so I grew up hearing a lot about methodology and it's not really part of journalism. It's, journalism is very product oriented. It's not process oriented. See, and you don't explain your process, right? So, you don't say, and so sometimes if you start a story like, well, I'm going to research the one-child policy, so I'll have my assistant go out and find 5 people who have suffered abuse at the hands of the one-child policy, and you're like, well, you pretty much know what kind of story you're going to get, right? You've already, you've cooked the books basically. And it's more useful sometimes to think about how can I be open-ended in this exploration? How should I structure my research? And of course, the journalism can't set up the kind of surveys or the sort of things that you would do as a social scientist, but you can be influenced by them. And I would do that in my research. Like when I researched a town, I wrote a long project for National Geographic in Zhejiang province. And the first step, I drove along a section of a new highway to kind of visit a range of communities, probably more than a dozen communities, to try to see which one seems like it might be at a stage where it can tell me something about how development works. I chose one at the end of that 2-week trip. Then I went back and spent 2 weeks in the place talking to a huge range of people, factory owners, construction workers, assembly line people, government officials. And the whole time I'm very open, but I'm thinking who might be the main characters or who might be the people I follow over a period of a year or two. And at the end of a couple of trips like that, I sort of made that decision, right? So it's not like rigidly structured the way a social scientist would do it, but I'm being informed by that tradition. And I think that idea of process is really, really important. And I think it's something that I always wanted more exchange between the social sciences and journalism. And that was one thing that I always wanted.
我们都应该向何伟同志学习. He's a model worker. That's fantastic. I love that. There was this anecdote I've repeated a few times because I heard it and it really stuck with me. Pete, you were on this panel with Orville Schell and with Evan Osnos and New Yorker writers past and present on China. But it was what Jiayang Fan said that really stuck with me. David Remnick had asked her about what it feels like as somebody who spent her early life in China. to read English language reporting on China. And she said something so brilliant. It said, it's like looking at a familiar part of my body through an X-ray. Said, it's like, maybe these are my words I'm adding, but it's literally penetrating, right? It's anatomical precision, but it didn't feel organically real to her. And that's always really resonated with me. So that accuracy doesn't add up always to realism. So yeah, it's things to live by. And the problem is, of course, that it's not possible for everyone to write about all the bridges that didn't collapse, and it's not possible. They're going to write those stories that are the man bites dog stories. But that said, I think we can kind of try to understand the optical properties of this lens, the media lens that we're looking through, and it's like understand how it invariably will distort some. I don't believe there is some grand conspiracy of media to smear the image of China. I've never believed that. But that doesn't mean that it's free entirely of biases either. And many of them are baked in and structural and result from things that are very noble and that I'm grateful for in, the way that media, that news reporting is practiced in the United States, for example. During the years of the Trump administration, I sure was glad for that adversarial approach, right?
In thinking about issues of accuracy and bias, and I mean, I'm also thinking, as we talked about social media a few minutes ago, just about the cloud of information and opinions, circulating around, and often obscuring as much as it maybe more than it illuminates. And thinking about these things, this is a somewhat unfair question, if you could pick one, but if you could pick one persistent myth or bias that you feel is really getting in the way of, because we're here in the United States, I'll say, of Americans understanding China and really holding back insight and maybe sympathy or empathy, or maybe just understanding, what would that be?
Yeah, Kaiser, let you start in this one.
Well, thanks, man. I would say that, you already used the word in your question. It's empathy. I think that it's not so much a misunderstanding as the lack of this piece of an approach. I'm a huge advocate for what's called cognitive empathy. It's not your run-of-the-mill emotional empathy that we all come equipped with, but it's actually, an empathy that needs to actively inform itself. You need to know something about the mental furnishings of your counterparty to understand what their values are, what their historical experiences have been, to understand what habits of mind shape. I mean, so that is a habit of mind that I want to see adopted. I mean, I think we can't all be China experts. I certainly am not one, but what we can do is have a set of criteria that we apply when we're trying to figure out, can this woman be trusted? Can this person who's talking to me with authority on China be trusted? And I would say one of the habits of mind to look for is reflexive cognitive empathy, that this person every time will put him or herself in Chinese shoes and make a good faith effort to see what it looks like from that point of view. One of the most important ones, along with that historical acuity I was talking about, along with humility. I mean, anyone who calls him or herself a China expert can probably safely be ignored. I think this kind of holistic approach, the cognitive, integrative complexity, the dragonfly eyes that I always like to bang on about. I mean, just having a more sort of multi-angle view. So that's what I would say is what we're missing is the ability to sort through the good and the bad.
Yeah, and I think as part of that empathy and the understanding of perspective, I mean, it can be very hard to understand how things might look to a person who's in China, right? I mean, I think we look at this place and there's been all this incredible change, the amazing economic change. I mean, 800 million people lifted out of poverty. and cities transformed, the countryside's transformed, and it's the same party. The same party's in charge. I mean, I write about this in my book because I taught there in the 1990s, and then I taught there again 20 years later, and some of even the slogans are the same, and basically the way the cadres present themselves are the same. And I think as a foreigner, you're always thinking, well, you've changed all this stuff, why can't you change the politics? But when you talk to people there, you can also understand that their perspective might be, we've changed all of these things. Maybe it's better for some things not to change, or maybe not yet, or it's some of these anchors of stability may mean something different to people. Haven't we changed enough? Haven't we done enough? And I did find that with the people that I knew in the 1990s on, that I think they had been through so much change, that they had been through so much, this wrenching experience, and it was inspiring in many ways because their lives were improved. But it was understandable why they didn't focus on some of the issues that we might from a distance expect them to focus on. And you don't really understand that until you're sitting there talking with them. And you also understand it better when you've known them for 20 years. And I always felt like I could sympathize with that. I understood where they were coming from. And they would often, their perspective was often, well, the party there's some things that I really don't like, but there's some things that are good, and it's okay with me.
Well, we have a couple questions from the audience, and we'll turn to those in a minute. But because you've just been talking about change, and a lot of change and disruption, and then a desire for some stability, I can't help thinking it's a moment to ask both of you, since we have you here, as you look ahead. I don't want to say we're post-COVID. We're not yet, of course, as we know from the numbers. Because I, in my other life, am a scholar of ancient Greek and Latin. Maybe we're peri-COVID or para-COVID. We have these other Greek prepositions we can use that mean like we're living alongside it, or it's all around us. But as we come out of this moment in thinking about change and disruption, could you say a little bit about each of you about the long-term impacts you see of COVID on China as we look ahead? I know it's hard. It's like a crystal ball.
I have the advantage of just having had that conversation a couple of days ago, and having edited that conversation this morning. I interviewed a brilliant Yale law scholar named Taisu Zhang, who has written a paper about this very issue. And I mean, about one specific aspect of it. And he basically sees the COVID pandemic as having really seen the massive expansion of the Chinese administrative state. I think that a lot of us saw, many of us were sort of cheering it on in the early days, and really kind of in awe of China's state capacity and its ability to for a couple of years deliver kind of a COVID-free experience in China. And we also saw, when it was in kind of a frightening overdrive, when China kind of became this biosecurity state, and made use of not just the QR codes that we all had on the health code apps or whatever, which is something that interestingly they did dismantle, but a lot that they won't dismantle that will become a sort of permanent fixture. And that includes just sort of the penetration of the administrative state all the way down to the lowest levels of government, these sort of quasi-formal things like sub-districts, and then very, very local, neighborhood committees. They have more resources, more capacity, more power now, and that's likely to remain. And that is largely a function of COVID. Although I did put the counterfactual to him. I said, would this have happened if it had not been for COVID? Because he was saying that it was on its way, and he said, no, it wouldn't have happened, not at this speed, and not with this intensity. So that's, I think we can safely say that's one of the major impacts of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard to analyze. I think China is a really unusual case because of dramatically different performance at different phases of the pandemic. I mean, it's a really interesting case when we look at this, because it basically, the way I see it is there are three phases, two of which I was there for. The first one was kind of the Wuhan phase, right? Where everything went wrong in Wuhan. And you could see reasons why that happened. The main ones being that local governments in China sort of instinctively will cover up things and try to prevent higher levels from knowing, and they don't have a free press that can investigate stuff. And so those things really cost China. But then you have kind of the second phase, which starts, probably basically January 23rd, and then and goes on for a long stretch, which was when things were, their performance was excellent, and you could see that they benefited from having these strong bureaucratic structures like the Juehui, the neighborhood committees that Kaiser referred to, which are communist things, but they go way back, right? I mean, the Song Dynasty, they had the Baojia system, Li Jia system. I mean, Chinese have done this since imperial times, where they have kind of local structures, cell-like structures. It long predates communism, and is a way to get information back and forth from the center to the to the neighborhood or the rural level, and that worked really well. And I think in a way it wasn't covered adequately in the West because of kind of our biases. And I wrote about it, and of course I was attacked for it. If you wrote and said that China was doing a good job at that phase, you were going to get criticized and accused of. But I think there was really no argument, and having observed it on the ground, and also benefited from it. My kids were in school in May of 2020, and there was no chance of anybody in our family getting sick, and I was doing face-to-face interviews from April, and so that phase, was totally different from the first one. And then of course you have the third phase, which is when they basically it's part of it is hubris. There was too much pride in their success in that second phase. There was, too much pride in their vaccine and not being willing to let the licensing of the foreign mRNA go through. And I think probably also not enough group decision making. I think in previous generations, China was more, would big decisions would be made more by, with input from other people. I think this probably reflects Xi Jinping just having too much say and people being afraid of him. And so that was a massive failure, So I think it's really hard to see how this settles on people there in terms of what is their conclusion, like what the Chinese, I've been surveying my students, and I last surveyed them in end of November. And at that point, it was surprising because that was during the zero COVID, was clearly not working well by that point. But their assessment, I asked them to rank the government's response on a scale of 1 to 10. And out of 40 students who responded to me, these are students I taught in the 90s, their average was 7.9. They still rated the government very high. These were not people living in Shanghai. These were people in provincial China. So I think it's really hard for us, and we're not getting really good data. I mean, this is a small sample. These are just people I've known for 20 years. And so it helps me think about things, but it's not what you really want, a proper large scale survey. But it's hard for us to predict, I think, what conclusions the average Chinese person takes from these three really radically different phases of the COVID response in China.
We've now been thinking about, I asked you to look ahead, and we have a question from the audience, which goes the other direction and asks about conceptions of history. And this audience member wants to ask, or is asking, what conceptions of history are important in China right now? And I guess looking ahead a little too, 21st century historical development. What theory of history? Probably, I'm guessing the asker is thinking about teleology or destiny or contingency, or and you can fill it in as you like. But also recommendations. Do you recommend anything to read on this topic? But the question is, the question of the theory of history and conceptions important in China right now that are shaping people's thinking about the future to come. It's a good one.
I actually have an idea that has been gestating for some time, and it's not really ready for prime time, but here it goes. I think for the last 180 years, the period that we've traditionally called modern Chinese history, there has been, and here I'm cribbing directly from, and here's your first recommendation, the works of Joseph Levinson, who was a UC Berkeley historian, an intellectual historian, who very sadly died in 1969, but he was very, very young, unfortunately. But he wrote a trilogy of books called Confucian China and Its Modern Fate. The ideas are in some of his other works, for example, in this book on Liang Qichao, who was one of the foundational intellectuals in Republican China as well. But his idea was that the question at the center of Chinese political and intellectual life was simply, how do we attain wealth and power in a way that is consonant with our identity as Chinese? So it has this element of Chineseness in it, and then this quest for wealth and power. We're not entirely over the line yet, but I would say that in recent years, there's sort of a critical mass of people, at least it's within sight, this idea that there is an unquestionably Chinese path, or they've claimed it to be a Chinese path that has produced wealth, power, and national dignity. And so that question, while not fully answered, is getting there. So we're really sort of at the cusp of a different historical epoch, where in a new question will animate Chinese life, and we're already seeing it being asked. And it has to do with what kind of a power will China be in the world today. So I think that still today, the question of the century of humiliation, which is a trope that the party likes to use and still drives out, but it certainly has some basis in reality. I mean, if you understand the history of China from the Opium War through these efforts to revive China in the mid-19th century, despite the horrors of the Taiping uprising and the Nian rebellion and the predations of the imperial powers, and then the betrayal at the end of the First War at Versailles, looking at China's whole horrifying history of that century, it's quite understandable why that narrative persists. It's weird to me how often I hear people who should know better ask, why can't you just get over it? And I keep imagining that same person, usually an American, saying that to a Black American and saying, why can't you just get over the trauma of slavery? I mean, you would never think to do that, but for some reason, it becomes acceptable when you turn it to China, to just sort of have this expectation that they should be able to simply put it all behind them, and that we're now competing on a level field. So that's one thing. But we're in an interesting moment where we're moving out of that former an age dominated by a former question and into an age that will be dominated by different questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, that historical consciousness is interesting, especially in the young. I mean, I would often ask, when I was teaching at Twanda, I asked the students, what's the greatest period in Chinese history? And most of them didn't say today. They would still tend to look back. They would talk about the Tang Dynasty usually. Sometimes it'd be a Song or it is, again, it's their conception of the past and of what that means to today and to the future is, I think, quite different than what it is for us here in America.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. A couple of audience members have also reflected on the difficulty, whether you're thinking of the inherent difficulty of learning Chinese as a language for an English speaker, or just the difficulty of accessibility because it's not taught in very many places. And it's a real question. We think about it all the time, and at ACLS when we think about funding choices and what kinds of programs to support. I mean, how do you deal with as either an evaluator of a grant application, or switching context to the university or the college, if you're a teacher and you're trying to advise someone who's a brilliant analyst in this case of China, but hasn't had the chance to study Chinese, and is how big of a barrier should that be? And I think most scholars would say it's a gigantic barrier, and it's one that has to be overcome if you want to say anything respectable and legitimate, honestly, in scholarship. How do you grapple with learning the language? How do you see that? How does that loom large or small in your own experience, and when you advise people who must come to you all the time and ask you for advice about how to pursue either a career in journalism in traditional or new media or in academia?
Well, I mean, I, I guess the standard thing that I would always is you have to try to find a way to be immersed as much as possible and to get over there. I mean, that's part of the problem with this particular moment. But I mean, that was one thing we had going for us in the Peace Corps. In retrospect, I always wish that I had done a formal course after the Peace Corps. It's easy to talk about that afterward because I have kind of a very rough foundation in Chinese because so much of it was basically on the street. And if I were to do it over again, I probably would have added some sort of more formal program. But we went through this with our daughters. I mean, we put our daughters in the public school in Chengdu. They didn't speak Chinese. We put them in the third grade. There were no other Westerners in the school of 2000. And we just felt like this is something we value and this is going to be the most efficient way to do it. And it worked. They learned quickly. And then we keep it up. I mean, they get up sometimes at 5:15 in the morning here in Colorado, so they can have a class with their tutor in Chengdu. So you have to value it, and you have to try to support it and continue it. It does have to be a really high priority.
Wow, amazing. To this question of how good does your Chinese need to be taken seriously as a scholar? I mean, look, the China field is not one field. It's a million. I mean, it's every discipline you can think of, every natural science, every social science, and every branch of the humanities that's applicable in the US is applicable in China, right? So, applied to China. So, if you want to be a sociologist or an anthropologist, if you want to be a political scientist, or you're going to need Chinese, right? There's no question about it. But that doesn't mean that. See, I'm very interested in talking, for example, to a lot of the virologists, the molecular biologists about their understanding of zoonotic versus lab leak origins in that debate. And I don't expect them to all speak Chinese. I mean, and I think that they have, it just simply depends on the field that we're talking about. But I mean, Pete's absolutely right that if you do want to undertake it, immersion's the only way to do it. If China is inaccessible, but by the way, we just had the good news today that visas, the 10-year visas are back. Even if you had one that was issued before March 28th of 2020, it's now valid again as of March 15th. So a couple of days from now. So it's very exciting. But no, I mean, if you can't afford to fly to China, go to Flushing, New York, Flushing, Queens. That's all Chinese. I'm joking, but don't be daunted by the language. It is a tough language. But Pete, man, you learned Arabic, right? That couldn't have been easy.
Yeah, I mean, with these, and with any language, I didn't get as far with Arabic as I did with Chinese, but I got to where I could do reporting on my own without a translator, which really helped. It helped to be able to be independent.
Well, yeah.
But describing the process was really useful in both places. I wrote about what it was like to study these languages. You learn so much along the way, and capturing that snapshot can tell you, a huge amount about a culture and about politics or economics or how people think. So it's always valuable.
Well, you had such good devices for kind of storyfying your learning. I mean, obviously in the Buried, there was just I can't believe that it was entirely coincidental that every vocabulary list was so totally germane to the politics of the moment. But
it really was, though, actually, because it's like when the Chinese list, because I went back, because I still had all my Chinese notebooks that I used for studying Chinese and in Fuling and all my conversations. And it's just so much economic stuff. I mean, the textbook was all like political stuff, right? So you learned all this stuff, about the standing committee or all this political terminology, which was actually somewhat useful. Like I can remember going to a hotel and they wouldn't let me in because I was a foreigner and I was traveling in the summer, and I just used all this political jargon to claim that like the Renda had changed this law, and it just total nonsense. But just because I had these words, they're like, okay, let's let the guy stay here, so you could apply it. But all the stuff you were studying in conversation in China was so much economic oriented. I mean, I learned also like stock market and all these terms that you would use. And in Egypt, you really needed this political vocabulary. You needed to talk, you need to be able to know what the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood are, you know, if somebody is, you know, this political term, that political term. And those, so the, you know, language, I think there was some comment in there that it's like a river you step into once, because it changes all the time, you know, and every moment has its own language. And just like the language my daughters learned in Chengdu during COVID is unique, you know, and that's a snapshot of that moment.
You know, I don't know, Joy, if you've read Rivertown, but the device that Pete uses is there's this big sign that he runs by every day, and each day it's almost like Wheel of Fortune. There's like new characters that emerge on the that he can read. It's very clever, and is a fantastic device. What would John McPhee have called that? What is that? That's not a set piece, or
not a set piece. Yeah, I mean, repetition is important. Yeah, okay. You got to learn how to use repetition in writing. Yeah,
that is outstanding.
Well, it's useful to hear this perspective and valuable, because one of the things, you know, we also find ourselves advocating for, and we understand, you know, years and years and years and years in undergraduate and then graduate education, it can put people in vulnerable positions, make them exploitable, and, you know, be in a kind of extended infantilization of life. But at the same time, we need time, and that's always a struggle to talk with university administrators who themselves are struggling with budgets and tight numbers. And yet, you know, trying to respect the need to immerse, to spend time studying a language, you know, it doesn't come all in one flash, as you well know, especially on those runs. We have I think, time for one more question. This one's mainly directed at Peter, because you had said that you had commented earlier, Peter, on militarism in the United States and compared it to China with your image of the junior high school student carrying the rifle at the ceremony after the Pledge of Allegiance. And the audience member says, but military displays are glorified on Chinese social media, especially when international tensions are stoked. So can you comment further on that?
Yeah, and there's a lot of the displays in China, but do you know any middle-class Chinese parents who want their kid to go in the military? You know, I don't know any, you know, I don't, it's not, you know, do you know any elite Chinese who left their career to join the military? I know a lot of those people in America. Like Matt Pottinger did that, right? He was a journalist. He was a colleague of my wife's at the Wall Street Journal, and
now he's Satan.
He left to join the Marines, and that was a good move for him, right? He built a political career out of that. The funny thing is when he did that, I remember some of the American colleagues were like, "Oh, he's really brave. He's really," and the Chinese are like, "That's totally insane. Why would you join the military?" You know,
and they were right.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a positive in our culture, in my opinion, and I think actually that is something that makes, you know, that I like about China, is it isn't a deeply militaristic society. And Egypt, by the way, is a deeply militaristic society. And if you want to get somewhere in Egypt, joining the military is a good way to do it.
Do we say thank you for your service to people in China?
I mean, it would be more like China to let the teachers board the plane first.
Right.
Bottom line.
Yeah.
You know, and I respect that, right? I mean, in China, like the respect with which people treat the teachers, that's something we could learn from. There are things in China that we could learn from. And I mean, with the years I was in China watching my daughters, that was something that I took away from it. And of course, my sister, who's a teacher in Columbia, Missouri, quit during that time because she was sick of the parents, basically, because they have no respect for education or for the people that teach their children. So yeah, there isn't this sort of worship of the military. I think it's at a different, you know, it's quite different in China. Yeah, you can see all these displays and they have the parades on Tiananmen, but when you get down to and you talk to average people, what are their values? What are the things that they want their children to do? And also, what are the lines of influence and power? Do people join the military to advance their careers like Matt Pottinger did? And I didn't see that much in China.
Really helpful. I think that was exactly what that audience member wanted to hear, was that greater detail. We have just a few minutes left, so could I ask you to leave us with a final thought each of your coming out of our discussion, whether it was about the impact of COVID or social media or higher education, or the cultivation of research and understanding for our audience of likely mostly scholarly people or supporters of scholars working in and outside China studies.
Pete,
all you. I need some time to formulate my idea.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything right off the top of my head. I mean, I hope that we can sort of sustain the interest and enthusiasm for China studies during this difficult period. I mean, I think that's part of the way to look at this, is that this is a hard time. It's not necessarily permanent, there is this sort of darkness in the way we view China, and it is a tougher phase. I mean, I was there, and there are more restrictions on people, definitely. But at the same time, it's not everything that's going on. I mean, I remember having an interview in Beijing, and a guy said it's like a frozen lake, and from the surface, all you see is the ice, but there's still stuff moving under the surface, and I could see that as a teacher. And I was actually quite heartened by my experiences as a teacher there, in that I really liked the students. I wasn't sure what that would be like, because I taught in the 90s was a special moment, and the kids that I taught in the 1990s were really special. These were rural, poor kids who were often the first in their entire villages to go to college. They appreciated it, and they worked so hard. And, to watch them over the years, move themselves out of poverty and become sort of middle-class urban people was inspiring. And I thought that was a pretty tough act to follow. But I was not at all disappointed in the students I taught from 2019 to 2021. I mean, I found them to be remarkably hardworking. They were very observant. They were much more savvy about their own society. That was a big difference. That they had a big, partly because China's been stable for so long, and also because their parents were useful resources for them. Like the kids I taught in the 90s, their parents were farmers, and the world was changing, so their society was changing so fast that the older generation often didn't have that much to offer. That's not really the case with the young people now, and so they had this nice interaction with their parents and a nice inheritance of knowledge from their parents. So I found them quite inspiring to work with. And I also found there was a lot of talk about the Xiaofenhong, the little pinks, and the sort of rabid nationalism among young Chinese. And that wasn't my personal experience. I think that idea gets exaggerated, and I think social media kind of amplifies that in a way that's not necessarily accurate. And I felt the kids that I taught in the 90s were much more narrowly patriotic than the young people I taught today. So that to me was something uplifting. I think it's important to remember that there is like a pretty highly functioning education system that's at work there. It's producing a lot of people, who have real skills, and, we should do what we can to understand them and to support them because a lot of them are over here studying too at different times. To remember that, and to remember that it's not all just competition.
Yeah, you can see the surrounding countryside in China from many different hilltops, and we have to stop this habit of only seeing it from the redoubt of national security. I think that we are in a full-blown moral panic right now in this society over China. I think that a few years ago, I was in one of these conversations with a group of people who work on China, and the question to us was, "Are we in a Cold War?" And one very wise man said, "I think a Cold War exists between two countries when the organizing principle of life in each country is hostility toward the other." And I thought, phew, we're not there yet. But now when I look around, and I think that we can't pass any piece of legislation in the United States without, summoning up this demon China, and without making it all about competition with China. I'm really starting to worry that it has become that way here. When I can just see us lose our collective minds over a balloon, and then start talking about China in terms of existential threat. It's just, I'm deeply worried. I do worry not about the Xiaofenhong, the jingoistic nationalists in China, as much as I do about the rabid nationalists in America, because they are responding in a way, this weird inchoate paroxysm of just sort of spasmodic kind of lashing out. It's behavior really unbecoming to a superpower that should be quite confident. We have, I think, we had at least wonderful core values and institutions in this country, as an open, tolerant country that is, self-purifying in so many ways, and by not being afraid, by allowing, this free sort of competition of ideas, we have a kind of an immunity to the very bad ones. But now we're acting as though there were, you know, reds under the bed. I mean, we're entering a new period of neo-McCarthyism, which is very, very bad for people who look like me or who look like the rest of Pete's family. I think we're in a pretty dark time right now, and we shouldn't undersell that.
Well, it's an ominous note to end on, but not inappropriate. Given the tenor of the times, we have a strict rule of ending on time for ACLS events, and I'm sorry to do it this time because I could listen to you talk for a lot longer. But let me thank both of you for joining us and straddling that sometimes uneasy distance between media and a public readership, public listenership, public audience, and scholars. And thank you for your sympathy and interest and desire to connect with our audience. Really, really appreciate it. It's really a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
The pleasure's
for joining
been
us.
mine. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you. And thanks everyone in the audience for tuning in. And thanks to my colleagues behind the scenes who made this all possible. Thanks, Dina, for setting us up, talking about China studies. A happy evening and a thoughtful one, I think, to everyone who tuned in. Thanks very much. Take care.
Take care.